Well, hey, everybody. It's good to see you. Welcome to our first update podcast for Harbor Online Community. This is a way for us to share with you, whether you were able to join us on Thursday night or not, some of the content that we shared together and some of the ideas that came out and maybe some of the questions that are still lingering. So this summer, we are doing intergenerational VBS. So over the next few weeks, you're going to be hearing from some of those good old Bible stories that we heard as kids and maybe learning about them in a new way. So this week, John was talking about Jonah and the whale. So John, what were we talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Don. We talked about a lot. I think the gist of what we looked at with Jonah was the idea that this is written as satire. And it's really actually quite brilliant satire. And so a satire is like a piece of art that uses humor to attack something, usually attack a certain perspective on something. And in this case, the kind of shocking thing to many folks, to me, when I first learned this, is that the thing being attacked by Jonah is a particular theology that you find in the Bible. If you flip back to the prophet Nahum, if that's how you say Nahum's name, it's just a long attack on the city of Nineveh and wishing that God would bring vengeance and destruction upon the people of Nineveh. That's the theology you find in the prophet Nahum. Then 150 or 200 years later, this story is written about this prophet Jonah, who yearns for the people of Nineveh to be destroyed by God's vengeance. It's just a person who is inhabiting the theology of Nahum, but he's a ridiculous figure. He's like the worst prophet of all time. He makes blunder after blunder. He's comically narrow-minded. And in the end, God, the whole book is about God saying, your theology is messed up, Jonah. I love the people of Nineveh. And why can't you get with the program and love them too? And so that's kind of what we looked at. We looked at the specific scene where Jonah is thrown overboard and goes inside the whale, because that's the scene at VBS that we really focus on, right? On our felt board or on our crafting or whatever. It's the whale, it's the prophet. And that moment is, if you actually read the book and you read it as satire, that is one of the moments of the most irony. This is what we looked at in our meeting last week. The idea that when Jonah is in that whale, he prays this prayer. It's written in a very flowery language. It reads like a psalm, but he's basically patting himself on the back in this prayer. He's like, I'm so glad I'm not a pagan like those sailors I was just hanging out with on the boat, because my religion is so good. Meanwhile, seeing how the storm has calmed after they threw Jonah overboard, all the sailors, the so-called pagan sailors, they're all like praising God up on the ship. So it's like this funny moment where he thinks he's so much better off than these sailors. Meanwhile, not because of his effort, but despite his horrible work as a prophet, they actually now are praising the God of Israel. So that was the gist, I think, of what we looked at. I'm curious what your thoughts were, Don. Like, I know you are a learned scholar, but I don't know how much you've looked at Jonah or what your VBS experiences of Jonah have been. So what was it like for you Thursday night?
It was so much fun. And I had never heard this satire piece before. And I thought it was so interesting. I mean, you said at the very beginning that, like, this is the Bible as we read it, the Bible criticizing itself and making fun of itself, which just, I think, when you look at some of the really over the top, Psalms and other bits of work, you go, I wonder, right? Like, is humor part of this? Because we often think of it as like exaggeration or trying to teach a lesson, but like, what about humor? And that way that I think we've learned, over these crazy political years where people were starting to turn to humorists for their daily news rather than the newscasts, because the analysis was just so cutting and subversive. And that has always been, I mean, satire has always been about punching up too, right? Like it's never satire if you're making fun of people who are more vulnerable than you. It's always about punching up and bringing down the people, just kind of knocking down a few pegs, the people who have some power. So it makes me wonder, it makes me think this must have been more than Nahum who was at this, right? Like this must be a pretty prevalent way of thinking, that God is sending us into, to encounter these people, but we don't really want to be in relationship with them. We want them to be conquered. We want them to be destroyed. And God is saying, no, I want you to be in a relationship with these people you're encountering.
Yeah, and Jonah never gets there in the story too. That's the funny part. The book ends, Jonah is raging against God and against everything out in the field, right? Yeah, it's such a provocative book. And you mentioned like the satire piece, and in our meeting, I asked people for some examples of satire, and someone immediately said the Colbert Report. And I think that's like a great example, right? Stephen Colbert is in a sense the author of that show, and he is trying to punch up at the powerful, like conservative media. And now there's obviously left-leaning media in the US and elsewhere also, but Fox News, for instance, has been and is the #1 watched cable news network in the US. And so he's punching up by pretending to be a Fox News host. I mean, that's what he's doing. And he's just showing how ridiculous the mindset is. And I think it's the same thing. The author of Jonah loves the Ninevites, maybe has like gotten to know someone from Nineveh, right? And formed a real, actual intimate relationship with them. And so thus they're humanized to the author. And so now there's this work of satire to say, well, here's what it looks like for someone to really try to live out the theology of, not just Nahum, but like, I'm sure many, many people at that time had that kind of hatred, toward their enemies in Nineveh.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, hatred and enemy are words that we don't use much anymore, but there's still people and groups that we treat as our enemies. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we want to chat about like what questions might still linger for us after our discussion last week. And I think for me, it's really what you were just saying. Like, okay, so I'm not walking around talking about I hate these people, or like, these people are my enemies, but who is it that we have maybe written off? And who is it that we do have some resentment toward, the way that Jonah felt about the Ninevites? And like I shared at the meeting, for me, there's some specific people and specific groups of people that I have a hard time, I think, loving the way that I believe God does love them. But another thing I've thought is just continuing to interrogate this boundary point between Christians and non-Christians. And that's the thing that I'm continuing to ponder. I don't have the answers. It's not like I think all distinctions should be removed, right? There are people who love the Christian faith and get a lot out of it, and they want to be identified as Christians, and that's awesome. I identify as a Christian. There's folks who don't, and they should be able to identify as non-Christians. But I just wonder if maybe this book is inviting us to at least erase a little bit that boundary point, or the theological significance that we place on that boundary point. So that's something that I've taken away from our conversation last week. Anything lingering for you?
Yeah. So I'll respond to this, and then I'll just share another perspective that came out of some of the discussion we had. The idea of how we treat our enemies, and that what we were saying one of the things we were saying in our group was that it's really hard to treat someone as your enemy when you get to know them. And just that importance of recognizing people, whoever they are, whatever they're doing, but recognizing them as a whole person. And I mean, I think this gets different when you're talking about groups and ideologies, but maybe it doesn't, right? Because if we're, and this is something I've been feeling more convicted about, I guess, because I can get really caught up in a cause and about like, they're wrong, we're right. We need to make sure that they don't get further ahead and that we get further ahead. And what the Spirit is starting to show me is that when I get out of these causes and actually start connecting with people, that's when I start to experience and also witness change and transformation. That's when love and empathy come in. They don't come in through like sending social media posts back and forth. They come in through engagement, whether it's online or in person. So I really loved what you said about could this be someone who has really gotten to know Ninevites or just Nineveh as a place, and or maybe experienced being othered and are trying to speak out against it.
Yeah.
The other bit, like, so this kind of shifts tack, because one of the first questions we had in our discussion was, when have you ever felt God like is leading you one way, and did you say yes? Did you go? And one of the experiences that a lot of us have had, if we've come out of like spirit-led traditions, like charismatic, is a really strong sense of like even hearing, like of having visions, of hearing God's voice, which for some of us, when we were attached to more toxic theologies, led us to do for some really cruel things and to say cruel things. And so Jonah is also hearing these words and hearing it so clearly, right? And I think for me, I read those stories and I just think, I wish it was so clear. But when it was so clear, it sometimes led me wrong. And so that's one of the lingering questions that I have is, what does it look like now with a more nuanced understanding of how the Spirit works in me and in people? What does it mean to hear God's voice?
Yeah, that's really good. That came up in my discussion room as well, quite a bit. This idea that, I think it was helpful to ask that kind of question to try to understand, like put ourselves a little bit in Jonah's shoes, even as this satirical figure. But like, there's times where we feel maybe led to do something, and sometimes we do those things and sometimes we don't. But yeah, the degree to which we all were sharing, how could we ever again trust that we're hearing anything at all from God? After I felt so led to do all this harmful theological stuff in people's lives. And so, yeah, that's definitely an ongoing question, I think. One other thing that was, I think, pretty big in our discussion room was this idea of how hard it is in any system to really get on the same page as God when it comes to like compassion and love for everyone. It's like a lot of us have flipped to like a more progressive from a more conservative viewpoint. But in progressivism, which I love progressivism, I'm all about it. But there is definitely a tendency to sort of separate everyone into like the oppressed and the oppressor, right? And the important thing is to like be in solidarity with the oppressed and fight for justice and dismantle unjust systems and all these really good things. But I think like the Ninevites are there's still a backdrop to this story where like Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. They wiped out Israel. I mean, these are a violent, bad society from the vantage point of Israel, right? And so I think there's a really hard question also lurking in this book and us reading it today, which is like, what is love for the oppressor? Like, does God love the oppressor? And love for the oppressor is not going to look the same as love for the oppressed. We don't need to, find ways to like be in solidarity with the oppressors. But does it mean something to love them? And what does it mean? And so those are some questions that I know we kicked around a lot in our discussion room and didn't really have any answers. And that's okay. We're not here to just answer all the questions, but I found that really helpful to reflect on, though.
Awesome. Yeah, man, that is an interesting and a great place, I think, to end our conversation. What an important and huge question. John, thanks for being the awesome first person to lead us through VBS. And next week, or this coming out week, Dottie's going to be talking about baby Moses, and we've already got our coloring pages out. So yeah, hope to see you all. If we don't see you Thursday, maybe see you here, and grab your crayons and do some coloring.
Awesome.
See you later,
Thanks,
Don.
Don.